Hello everyone, thank you for watching my presentation. My name is Pelai and I'm a recent graduate from the University of British Columbia. I will be presenting today research that was part of my master's thesis looking at governance aspects related to the movement of tree seed. There are over 250 million seedlings planted in British Columbia, Canada every year for reforestation actions. Increasingly, many trees are no longer adapted to the local environment in which they're planted, largely due to changes in climate. One increasingly common forest management response to this challenge is adapting tree seed transfer guidelines and policies to enable seed movement within or beyond the species' natural range. There can be a tendency, however, to view and understand forest policies ahistorically, for example, by focusing on current drivers of change. Yet, policy arrangements at any given time are the product of historical and political processes. So exploring historical contours of seed transfer policy can really help us understand present actions and also look at what drives change. My approach is informed by two literatures. The policy change literature studies how drivers and patterns of change take place. One framework to understand these changes is the policy windows framework developed by Kingdon, who identifies three main processes or streams of agenda setting: problem recognition, formation of policy proposals, and politics. When conditions within these streams converge, a policy window for change may open. The second literature is a co-production of knowledge literature, and insights from this scholarship help us understand the roles of knowledge in decision-making, including knowledge as a source of policy change. This literature investigates the mechanisms by which different forms of knowledge or different forms of expertise, including scientific, local, and indigenous expertise, are included or excluded in the production of environmental knowledge. With this in mind, my research question is the following. How has tree seed transfer governance changed over time in British Columbia? Specifically, I look at three governance attributes over time: actors and their objectives, policy instruments, and knowledge used to inform policy. In order to answer my research question, I analyzed all publicly available documents on the topics of seed transfer, related concepts like tree improvement, and climate change adaptation. This included ministry annual reports, forest legislation, strategic plans, technical reports, and many others. In total, over 1,000 pages were analyzed. This data was supplemented by semi-structured interviews with key informants. Documents were systematically analyzed using NVivo, which is a qualitative data analysis software, using thematic coding based on the governance attributes I described earlier. Interviews were also audio recorded, transcribed verbatim, and analyzed in vivo. Through my analysis, I identify four distinct eras. The first era starts in the 1940s and is characterized by limited regulation and seed transfer and an explicit emphasis on forest productivity as the main rationale for modifying seed transfer guidelines. The first seed zones are delineated during this time, and seed movement is not mandated, although fewer transfer restrictions are recommended. Task forces consisting of seed orchard managers, government scientists, and forest industry make recommendations for policy change. Forest productivity and growth, as I said, are the main objectives of seed transfer. Field experiments conducted by government scientists, especially forest geneticists, in addition to regression models related to geographic variables, are or constitute the main knowledge that is used to inform policy. This is an example of one of these government industry task forces from a memorandum released by the ministry. Research branch provenance test data was invaluable in arriving at the recommendations of this task group. Comment on the preliminary recommendation was solicited and received from scientists at the Pacific Forestry Center and from selected operational users of Douglas fir seed. The second era, starting in 1995, is characterized by mandated regulation of seed movement as opposed to guidelines. Seed transfer legislation is introduced, and the BC Chief Forester officially makes seed transfer decisions at this time. Government industry task forces continue to make recommendations, and the Forest Genetics Council is created, consisting of representatives from the government and forest industry, and this council acts as an advisory body. Objectives remain the same as before, but in terms of knowledge used to inform policy, we also continue to have internal expertise on provenance field trials, in addition to some ecological data. Seed could be transferred based on geographic elements, such as latitude or elevation. Whenever changes in seed transfer policy occurred, they, as I mentioned before, tended to be based on forest genetic evidence produced internally. For example, this document reads, "The transfer guidelines given here are based largely on early results from the provenance and progeny tests established by the research. Productivity is a key rationale for seed transfer policy." The third era, starting in 2005, the Chief Forester's standards for seed use are put in place. And this is another piece of regulation or legislation that governs all aspects of seed transfer. And these standards are continually amended, and these amendments start mentioning climate change as a driver of seed transfer policy change. Seed movement continues to be legislated, but there are more prescriptive and specific regulations based on geographical variables. One of the main objectives that emerges in this era, as I said, is to address forest health impacts associated with climate change. Internal genetic knowledge continues to inform policy in addition to GIS and modeling. And this is a geographically based science, policy, and decision support framework. Notably, during this era, seed standards are amended to allow for the assisted migration of Western larch. In the context of commercial forestry, assisted migration is the intentional translocation or movement of tree species in response to climate change, and these can be within their historical range or outside of their natural range. This was the first time that an explicit assisted migration policy of a tree species in North America was developed. And in the amendments to the seed standards, this is what it said. The purpose of these amendments are to expand the seed transfer limits of Western larch to increase species diversity and address the potential forest health and productivity impacts associated with a changing climate. So again, very much focusing on productivity and climate change. The fourth and final era starts in 2012 with the inception of a climate-based seed transfer system in British Columbia, which I argue is a paradigmatic change in seed transfer policy that emerged through the opening of a policy window, which I will elaborate on later on. During this time, mandated and legislated regulation of seed movement is based on climate variables as opposed to geographical ones. There is an increased emphasis on climate change adaptation and forest health, but the underlying objective is ensuring forest productivity and growth. Knowledge used to inform policy continues to be internal genetic knowledge, in addition to models and for the first time, genomics. This is now a climate-based science policy and decision support framework. When asked about seed movement in British Columbia, an interviewee said to me, "We have a decision-making system historically in which experts have been hired to make decisions. This is a science-led decision-making process, and I think it needs to remain that way. that is the information base from which decisions can then be made. So in summary, what changed and what didn't change? Climate as an explicit driver of seed transfer policy, and in relation to that forest health, those things did change. But what didn't change were the actors involved, specifically the provincial government and the government scientists within it, and the forest industry. Another thing that didn't change was the evidence used to justify seed transfer policy changes, which was biophysical, specifically genetic, and mostly internally produced. There are three main analytical insights that emerge from these analyses. The first is the legacies of government industry forest policy coalitions. One of these legacies is the limited participation from other actors in seed transfer governance, such as First Nations or Indigenous peoples. The climate objectives that also emerged in seed transfer changes did not emerge on their own. They coalesced with economic drivers that were important for the forest industry, such as forest productivity and growth. The second insight is the emergence of a climate-based seed transfer regime through a policy window. And in this case, the problem emerged through compelling events, such as the mountain pine beetle epidemic and droughts that threatened forest productivity. The policy is this climate-based seed transfer system had already been proposed and deemed technically feasible and cost-effective by government scientists within the ministry. And on the politics side, the BC Chief Forester was very supportive for climate change adaptation. And the public at the time in British Columbia was also very accepting of these policies, including the assisted migration of trees within natural range. So these three streams kind of came together, and change happened in this case, very much driven by climate change. The third analytical insight is this dominance of particular forms of knowledge used to justify policy over time. And this speaks to the influential government scientists that really act as policy entrepreneurs. And the persistent reliance on genetic insights have led to seed transfer policies that are tree-centric, as opposed to, say, landscape-centric, if it had been the case that ecological insights were dominant. So what are the implications for policy and practice? Looking ahead, and based on insights from history, we can expect that future seed transfer policy changes, we can expect that climate change would be a driver for seed transfer policy changes in the future and will continue to be a driver. We can also expect a more prominent reliance on genetic insights, for example, by the increasing use of genomics to inform seed transfer guidelines. And we can also expect an ongoing and influential role of the forest industry that has remained relatively intact over time. This analysis really speaks to the need for increased contributions from a wider range of expertise from different stakeholders that go beyond the forest industry, including, for example, Indigenous peoples. And the contribution of all these types of expertise in developing seed transfer policy can make these policies more effective in the long term. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.